Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. We are so glad you're here with us today because I want you to just imagine something for a second. Imagine the Savior of the world, long before he ever walked on water or multiplied loaves or preached to the masses.
Right, before any of the public miracles.
Exactly. Imagine him simply gripping a heavy, rough piece of timber. Imagine his sanding down splintered edges, wiping a thick layer of sawdust and grit from his eyes, just sweating profusely under that blazing Mediterranean sun.
It is a really striking visual, and it forces us to confront this reality that the historical texts tell us we usually just, gloss over.
Yeah, we totally do.
The sources we're looking at today argue that before he was ever revealed to the crowds as a redeemer, he was known in his hometown simply as a blue-collar worker.
And that is exactly the mission of today's deep dive. We are exploring the so-called lost years of Jesus. We have this fascinating stack of historical, linguistic, and theological sources in front of us, and they reveal Jesus not just as this ethereal spiritual teacher who floated above the fray of everyday life.
No, not at all.
Right, but as a laborer.
Yeah.
Someone who literally got his hands dirty.
Yeah.
We're going to uncover how the text suggests his years in that dusty workshop weren't just like wasted time or some divine waiting room. It was a profound period of preparation that forever dignified human labor.
It completely shifts the traditional understanding. The theological argument presented in these sources that God choosing a life with calloused hands is not some random accident of history.
Right.
It's actually a very deliberate revelation about how the divine views our own daily work.
Okay, let's unpack this, because as I was reading through these sources, I realized that my own modern assumptions, and honestly, probably the assumptions of millions of people who grew up looking at standard nativity scenes about Jesus' day job, are actually completely wrong.
Oh, they are entirely off base.
Yeah, so let's dismantle that classic Sunday school image, right?
Yeah.
The one of Jesus standing quietly at a pristine wooden workbench building, I don't know, nice little pine tables. What was the actual historical reality of his daily grind?
Well, to understand the physical reality of his life, we really have to look at the original language in the Gospel of Mark, specifically Mark chapter 6, verse 3.
Okay, what does it say?
So the locals in Nazareth, they're astonished by his teaching, and they ask a very specific question. They say, "Is not this the carpenter?" But the original Greek word that has been translated there as carpenter is tekton.
Tectun, which, that sounds an awful lot like the root word for modern terms like technology or architecture.
You hit the nail on the head. An architecton is a master builder, and the historical and linguistic sources reveal that a tekton does not just mean a woodworker.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it translates much more accurately to an artisan, a master builder, or essentially a general contractor. We have to examine what historians call the material culture of first century Nazareth.
And by material culture, we mean like the physical objects and local resources.
Exactly, the architecture that defined daily life in that specific time and place. Nazareth was this rugged land of omnipresent limestone. It was not full of dense, lush forests.
So they weren't exactly heading down to the local Galilean lumber yard to pick up 2x4s.
Far from it. While Jesus and his earthly father, Joseph, certainly would have crafted smaller wooden items that the agricultural community needed, things like yokes for oxen, wooden plows, maybe doors or roof beams.
Right, the essential farm tools?
Yeah, but they would have worked primarily with stone.
Yeah.
They were building houses out of heavy blocks, carving out farm terraces into the hillsides, and constructing these big stone watchtowers for local vineyards.
That sounds incredibly intense.
It was. The mechanics of this work involved heavy chisels, plumb lines, and just backbreaking lifting. It was heavy masonry and construction, plus they likely had to travel for it.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, Jesus had 4 brothers and multiple sisters. That is a very large family to feed. And Nazareth was tiny, maybe 400 people. So to find enough work, by necessity, Jesus and Joseph likely traveled a few miles away to Sepphoris.
Sepphoris, what was going on there?
It was a bustling Greco-Roman city being entirely rebuilt by Herod Antipas at the time. It was a massive urban construction site.
Wow. Okay, wait, hold on. If the historical reality is that he was essentially a first-century general contractor working mostly with stone, why have we spent centuries calling him a carpenter? How does a mistake like that survive for 2,000 years?
What's fascinating here is that the answer lies entirely in the history of Bible translation, and really how human beings tend to project their own world onto a text.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, so when early translators were bringing the Bible into European languages, specifically folks like William Tyndale with his highly influential English translation in 1526, They looked at the Greek word tekton, which they knew meant a builder, but then they looked out the window at their own environments.
Let me guess. 16th century Northern Europe was built almost entirely out of wood.
Yes, Northern Europe was incredibly timber-heavy. Their primary builders, the people constructing their homes and their towns, were carpenters.
Ah, that makes so much sense.
So Tyndale and others essentially projected their own European material culture backward onto the first century Middle Eastern text. That one simple translation choice forever altered our cultural image. It turned a Galilean stonemason into a European woodworker in the minds of millions of readers.
That is absolutely wild. It just shows how much our own cultural context acts as a filter for the information we receive.
Yeah,
We just assume the whole world looks like our neighborhood.
we really do.
But whether he was shaping limestone or planing cedar, the core historical fact remains the same. He spent the vast majority of his earthly life doing intense, physically demanding labor, which honestly brings up a massive question for me.
Was that?
Well, if the theological premise is that he is God, and he had the power to do absolutely anything, why spend 90% of his life doing backbreaking manual labor in the first place? I mean, he could have been born into the priesthood or royalty or just started his preaching ministry right at age 12.
The sources spend a lot of time on this exact question. He actively submitted to his earthly father and to the grueling demands of the ancient workplace. And to understand the theology of why that matters, the texts take us all the way back to the Old Testament context of work itself.
Right, the very beginning.
Yeah, culturally, we often operate under this deeply ingrained misconception that work is a curse, that it's basically a punishment for human sin.
Yeah, exactly. That it's just the penalty we pay because Adam and Eve messed up in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
We tend to think of work as the opposite of paradise.
But the theological sources point out that God himself is depicted as a worker from the very first pages of Genesis. He creates, he forms the dirt, he plants a garden, and on the seventh day, he rests from his work.
Work is presented as intrinsic to the divine nature then.
Precisely. And then in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, God puts Adam in the garden to till and keep it.
And this is happening before the fall, before sin even enters the narrative.
That is the crucial detail, but it goes even deeper linguistically. The Hebrew words used in Genesis for till and keep the words adhad and shamar.
Okay.
Those are the exact same words used later in the Old Testament to describe the sacred priestly duties of the Levites in the tabernacle.
Wait, really? So the act of caring for the dirt, like basic gardening and agriculture, was described by the ancient writers with the exact same vocabulary as leading worship in the holiest place on earth.
Yes. The argument these texts are making is that work, from the very beginning of the human story, was designed as an original gift.
Wow.
It was meant to be an act of worship, a sacred partnership with God to cultivate the raw materials of creation. It was a core part of human formation.
But then the fall happens, the rebellion in the garden, and work gets incredibly hard.
Right. The fall introduces toil. According to the biblical narrative, the frustration, the sweat, the thistles and thorns, the unfair bosses, the economic anxieties, those are the tragic results of the fall.
The toil is the curse, not the work itself.
Exactly. Work itself remains inherently holy. And the theological consensus of our sources is that by stepping into that workshop in Nazareth, Jesus dignified labor. He didn't bypass the gritty reality of the workplace to rush to the cross. He lived right in the middle of it.
He embraced it.
Yeah, the text suggests he was redeeming not just human souls, but the very sweat of the human brow.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener, who might be staring at a spreadsheet right now or, clocking in for a long shift at a hospital or driving a delivery truck? Because culturally, we treat our real spiritual life as the stuff that happens on the weekend in a religious building.
And our Monday through Friday work is just the necessary evil we endure to pay the bills.
Exactly. It's just a means to an end.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources are arguing that this ancient perspective completely shatters the artificial divide between the sacred and the secular.
Oh, I love that.
The theological texts suggest that serving through labor is not some second-class kingdom service. When you wrap your mind around the idea that the Son of God spent drastically more time swinging a hammer and hauling stone than he did preaching sermons, it fundamentally elevates your daily grind.
It really does. It changes everything.
The argument here is that every email you send, every project you manage, every diaper you change, or physical task you complete when it is done with love, integrity, and righteousness is a profound act of worship.
It's almost like finding out the CEO of a massive global tech company spent 20 years working the phones in the customer service call center before taking the top job.
That is a great way to put it.
When they finally take over and start making policies, those policies aren't just abstract corporate theory, right? They're based on the actual gritty friction of dealing with real problems every single day.
That is a brilliant analogy, and it perfectly transitions us to how those decades of physical labor directly forged the wisdom that Jesus would later share. When Jesus finally leaves the workshop and begins his public ministry, his teaching style specifically, his use of parables, is deeply informed by the mechanics of his trade.
Because the workshop basically built the pulpit.
Yes, he didn't just observe peasants working from the comfort of a hillside. He had lived their harsh economic realities. He knew exactly what it felt like when a masonry tool broke, when wood was too damp to use, or when the occupying Roman government demanded an exorbitant tax.
I love the specific examples the sources bring up to illustrate this. Let's look at that famous parable in Matthew 7 about the wise man who builds his house on the rock and the foolish man who builds his house on the sand. Traditionally, we read that as just a nice, neat spiritual metaphor about listening to God's word.
Which it is, on a spiritual level. But the historical sources reveal it's also a literal reflection of the harsh realities of first-century Galilean construction. Well, in that region, there are these dry riverbeds called wadis. In the dry summer, a wadi looks like a beautifully flat, sandy, perfectly cleared plot of land to build a house on. It looks ideal.
But it's a trap.
Exactly. As a Tekton, Jesus knew the mechanics of the region. He knew exactly what happened to a heavy stone structure in a wadi when the sudden winter rains cause a massive flash flood.
The house would just be destroyed.
Completely. If you had taken shortcuts and hadn't done the grueling work of digging down through the sand to hit the bedrock, your house was gone. That wasn't an abstract theory to him. That was professional architectural experience.
And there's another incredible example in the sources, the parable of the unfinished tower in Luke 14. Jesus is talking to the crowds about the heavy cost of following him and says, basically, who among you, wanting to build a tower, doesn't first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it?
The historical context here is deeply revealing. Remember earlier when we talked about Sepphoris?
Right, that big construction boom town just 4 miles away.
Yes. Jesus and Joseph would have walked those 4 miles at dawn, worked a brutal 10-hour day on noisy, dusty building sites alongside hundreds of other day laborers, and then walked 4 miles home.
What a grind.
And in a city like Sepphoris, working for wealthy elites or agricultural barons, Jesus likely had personal experience with clients who failed to pay for a build.
Oh, wow. So he had dealt with unpaid invoices.
Yeah, he had likely seen or even contracted on large stone projects like a vineyard watchtower that were abandoned half-finished because the client's money dried up.
He literally knew the frustration of a bounce check. He knew what it was like to be stiffed by a client. His vocabulary throughout the Gospels is so incredibly broad when you really look at it. He talks fluently about agriculture, sowing seeds and sifting wheat. He talks about finance, managing debts, investing talent. He talks about supply chain management and construction.
Because he interacted with all these spheres of society as a tradesman. He was negotiating daily contracts, buying raw materials, traveling the dangerous roads, and interacting with both the wealthy elite who commissioned the buildings and the desperately poor day laborers who dug the foundations.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We often treat his parables like clever marketing metaphors that he just invented on the spot to relate to the common folk.
Like a PR strategy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what the texts are showing us is that he wasn't pandering. He was speaking directly from his own resume.
He wasn't reaching for relatable anecdotes. He was drawing from decades of lived experience. And the theological sources argue that this validates something profound about how God operates.
Look at that.
By using these highly physical, vocational realities as the specific vehicles for eternal spiritual truths, Jesus was declaring that God is intimately involved in the entirety of the human experience. There is no sacred secular divide.
Because God understands the physical mechanics of the world.
Because he engineered it.
Yeah.
And then he came down and literally hauled stone within it.
He is the God of the architectural details, the God of the ledger, the God of the plumb line, the God of the harvest, which I think brings us to the final and perhaps most profound phase of his work. Jesus' earthly location as at Tekton reached its conclusion in a strict historical sense when he left Nazareth to begin his ministry. But the texts argue his identity as a builder did not end. It just transitioned.
Yes. He moved from building with physical stone and wood in the region of Galilee to building an eternal reality. The Gospel of John frequently uses the Greek word ergon, which means work or task or vocation, to describe Jesus' ultimate mission.
And what was that ultimate task?
The sources describe it as substitutionary atonement on the cross, which is essentially the theological concept that he was stepping in to take the ultimate penalty for sin on humanity's behalf.
The crucifixion. Which is so heavy to think about in this context because the very physical materials he had spent his life mastering were the exact materials used against him.
It is a dark and profound irony. He likely had incredible physical strength from decades of masonry, yet the physical elements of creation that he meticulously knitted together used his own daily tools, wood and iron nails, to execute him.
Wow.
One of our historical sources refers to the Roman cross as a brutal technology of death. But the theological beauty of the narrative is that the master builder didn't let the story end with his own destruction. The texts argue he took that twisted technology of death and fundamentally engineered it into the ultimate instrument of redemption.
He repurposed it. He took the absolute worst, most degrading instrument the ancient world had to offer and built salvation out of it. And what I find so compelling is that even after the resurrection, the texts say he is still building.
Yes.
I want to look at a specific passage, John chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. The context here is the night before he dies. His disciples are terrified. They're anxious. They know the political and religious tension has reached a boiling point. And Jesus looks at them and says, "Do not let your heart be troubled."
It is a deeply comforting command in a moment of panic. But it's the exact phrasing he uses next that connects so beautifully to everything we've been discussing about his trade. He tells them, "In my Father's house are many dwelling places. I go to prepare a place for you."
To prepare a place. Some modern translations say rooms, others say mansions, but the imagery is pure construction and architecture.
It is entirely architectural. In the ancient Middle Eastern context, when a son married, he would literally build a new addition, a new set of rooms onto his father's existing family compound.
Ah, so they would all live together.
Right. Jesus is speaking directly from his lifelong identity as a tekton. He is reassuring his bewildered friends that his impending departure isn't an abandonment, it's a relocation to a new job site.
The king is still building.
Exactly. And the theological consensus is that this current era of history we live in is simply the time he is allowing for his followers to gather more people while he actively prepares this heavenly abode.
It's incredible to think about the scale of that. I mean, if the biblical narrative says Jesus created the entire physical universe in 6 days, just imagine what kind of home a master builder has been preparing for the last 2,000 years.
This raises an important question for you, listening right now, based on the challenges presented in these sources. What does it mean for you to truly trust this builder?
Because he doesn't just hand them a map, right?
No. In that same passage in John 14, when the disciple Thomas asks how they can possibly know the way to this prepared place, Jesus doesn't just give him a blueprint.
Right, he says, "I am the way and the truth and the life."
Jesus wasn't just preparing a geographic location. The texts argue he declared himself to be the path itself. Trusting the builder, according to this theology, means trusting that his architectural work on the cross was entirely sufficient and that his ongoing construction in eternity is totally secure.
We have covered some incredible ground today. We started in the dusty, noisy, stone-filled workshops of Nazareth and those massive construction sites of Sepphoris, discovering that the historical Jesus was a rugged contractor wielding heavy tools, not just a quiet woodworker making tables.
A completely different image.
Yeah. We explored the ancient Hebrew text to see how his willingness to sweat and toil completely rewrote the dignity of human labor, suggesting that your daily work is not a punishment, but a holy offering.
We examine how those long decades of physical labor, dealing with the friction of the material world, forged the parables that would change history. Parables dripping with the hard-won experience of a man who knew the high cost of building.
Yeah, and finally, we saw how his identity as a builder culminated on the cross, where the theology states he repurposed the tools of his trade to secure human redemption, and how he is currently preparing an eternal dwelling place for his people.
It really is a powerful reminder from these texts that God deeply values the work of your hands today, just as he valued the work of Jesus' hands.
Absolutely. But before we let you go, I want to leave you with one final lingering concept drawn from our sources. It's a vision of the future found in the ancient texts.
Yes, looking at the prophecy of the new heaven and the new earth in the book of Isaiah, specifically chapter 65, It paints a picture that is very different from the pop culture idea of us sitting idly on clouds playing harps.
Right, floating around doing nothing.
Exactly. It is a vision of active, joyful creation. The text says that God's people will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. And beautifully, it says they will long enjoy the work of their hands.
Long enjoy the work of their hands. You know, the implication of that ancient prophecy is that our daily labor right now isn't just some temporary, frustrating necessity to pay the bills until we escape to an ethereal heaven.
No, not at all.
It is a shadow, a rehearsal for an eternal reality where we will continue to build, plant, and create, but without the frustration, the toil, or the decay introduced by the fall. So I want you to think about that tomorrow when you log onto your computer or clock in for your shift or pick up a tool. What skills, what passions, or what character traits are you cultivating in your job today that might just echo into eternity? Think about that the next time your work feels heavy or meaningless. Because according to these sources, the one who holds the universe together knows exactly what it feels like to grip rough timber, haul heavy stone, and wipe the sweat from his brow. Keep learning, keep building, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.